I spent 6 months getting here. The first 8 days were spent in a coma. It was medically induced. And there was the toughest 6 to 8 days I've ever spent in my life. I felt as if I was spiritually pinned down, and every identity and everything in my life that I had held dear to me was being washed, was being flashed across my face. I saw every flesh identity, and I couldn't move. Five years ago, well, let me start even beyond that. When I was a child, I knew I was called to walk a different road than anybody else around me, a road that very few men had walked. I knew that I was. In high school, I strove in the flesh to live up to that by being different. But that isn't what I was called to be, different. In the flesh, I was called to be a spiritual son, but I did not know that. At the age of 59, I found out I had a terminal disease, pulmonary fibrosis, a disease that killed my brothers and my mother. I took care of her for 3 years with it, and I saw her dwindle to death. My brother, 1 month after her passing, found he had it also. And 4 years ago, what was it? 4 years ago, he had a double lung transplant. It was a joyous time. But I had found out I'd had it. And I knew what the results were going to be. It would lead to death in every case. Outside of a transplant, it leads to death. I took an opportunity one night to go to the place I grew up in, the city where I now live. And I sat about one house away from the home I grew up in. And I wept to God and I said, "You called me to be different." And because I'm selfish, I was not. Because I was a victim my whole life, I was not different. I just was another victim in my mind of questionable parenting, of circumstances and situations that happened. And I sit before him now, and I was another victim of a disease that I did not bring upon myself. And the Father said to me, "Go find David." I had met David once, maybe twice. Neither time was exceptional. I met him in passing. And I called David immediately on the phone. And I said, "David, the Father has told me to find you." 2 days later, both of our families had lunch, had dinner together. And that began the beginning of a ministry that we would not only teach, but that we would learn to walk, that we would learn to live. A ministry of sonship. That was different. That's what the Father had called me to. And when I was in the coma, I could hear David. Don't let him fool you. You can hear in comas. I heard David say, "Brother, we have got to walk this road together. The Father will not let me teach this by myself. You must come along. It's taken me 6 months to get here. And as shaky as I stand here now, I'm going to sit down. But I am here by the grace of God. I am here to the glory of our God, to the glory of my Father who said, I do this for you and for others to see my glory. I was given 48 hours to live in the second coma. And that coma lasted 5 weeks. Both times in the comas that I was in, the identity, the first coma that I lived, as I spoke, every identity I lived came before me. All the accusations of Satan he railed against me. The accusations of my failures, of my identities of the flesh. And I was pinned down and I couldn't move. And I had to relive every one of those, like the life you have flashing before your eyes. The second coma I was in was different. I lived an alternative reality at that point. Everything that was happening to me, I incorporated into that coma. I lost my arm in that reality. I didn't know why. It was because of a disease I had. I had to cut my arm off. But in that reality, I was now faced with decisions to be made concerning the identities I lived. Would I walk away? Or would I again cling to them? And I can tell you that as I left that house of identities, they were nothing but mud in my hindsight. God had taken every identity I'd lived, every possession I owned, and it was now mud. They had no life. And I walked out of that house once and for all of those identities. Let me sit down. I told you I was going to bring this into a reality. Bring this to the life we live. I started this message with my wife bringing me to Warren Litzman's fellowship. I had gone to a church, and Jenny, who's joining me, brother, could I get the water? Thank you. I'm sorry, I need some water here. Okay, thanks. Ooh. That's good. Right there. That's what they call a good catch. I'd gone to a fellowship, and the Father gave me something to speak. And I walked up to the pastor in submission to that pastor. And I said, the Father's given me something. And the man that was a guest visitor stood on the pulpit. And he said, somebody here has something from God. And for 20 minutes we waited. And that pastor never gave me permission to speak what the Father had laid on my heart. As we were leaving, it may not have been important at all. But when I left the parking lot, I said to Jenny, I have had it with churches that will not let you speak what the Father's given you. Excuse me. And Jenny said, well, hey, guess what? Warren Litzman's group has started back up, and I want to go. And I said, let's go. From that moment forth, I became submerged in the revelation of spiritual birth, of the seed, the incorruptible seed that we're born again. But I asked myself, I said, self, why not, right? I said, self, who does that make us? If I'm born again and I'm a new creation, who is that? Who is that? That fellowship could bring me to a point of realization, of union, of me and Jesus, of you and Christ coming together. But it could tell me who that person was. And for 3 years, I listened to union message after union message after union. Me and Jesus, Jesus and you. I listened after time after time. And I said, who does that make us? And I found out. You see, we spend our whole life in an identity that doesn't belong to us. We spend our whole life in an identity crisis. We don't know who we are. We don't know who we are. We don't know who we are because we do not understand spiritual birth. If I were to ask you what spiritual birth means, I'd get various answers. I'm not even going to ask. Out of concern, it may embarrass us. Because I know my answer would have embarrassed me. I didn't know who I was because I didn't know spiritual birth. Well, one day I was vacuuming the house, and I asked God, I said, God, why don't you just kill us after we get saved so we don't have all these mistakes to live? And he said, why would I kill my son? Why would I kill my son? My spiritual sons. I forsake one, but I won't forsake you. I listened and I realized at that moment that we are birthed to become sons. But I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand. You see, I understood this left side of this diagram. I understood that Christ in me was the hope of glory. But I didn't understand what Christ in me meant. I thought it was me and Jesus. Me being red and Jesus being blue. I carved out a little space in my heart for him and said, there's where you live. That's where you live. Only come out on Sunday, please. Saturday's going to scare you. And if you don't like Saturday, sure don't show up on Friday nights. Well, the more spiritual I got, the more I realized, the more I thought that Jesus had to become Lord. Is this still on? That Jesus had to become Lord. You want to switch? Is this not loud enough? Oh, he has a good one. He kept a good one. He just like Jesus turning the water into wine, he saved the best for last. But I thought I thought I was becoming more spiritual, and Jesus would be bigger. Look at this one. Boy, he's Lord of that person's life. but I was still red. Jesus may have become more, and I may have become less, but there were still two of us who only came out on Sunday and maybe, if I had the chance, Wednesday nights. Pending the door not being locked. So I asked, how much more can there be? I said, Father, I'm tired of up and down, failure, success, good and bad. How many of you here have failed this week? Oh, yeah. That's the way I thought, too. Every day was a scorecard for me. When I failed, well, if you give me another chance, I'll do better. You see, I thought I was adopted. Israel was. I heard I was the new Israel. That's a lie. I thought I was adopted. That's Satan's biggest lie to us. But I'm not, and you're not. You're spiritually birthed. You have a Father who didn't adopt you. You have a Father who gave you His spiritual DNA. You are the I am in His identity. Your identity is the essence of God. It's the identity of the Father. One day I was walking to the park and I said, God, who am I? And He said, I am. That was quite a big jump from two people. I realized that being born again of the Spirit from above was not about me and Jesus. I realized everything I had believed my whole life was a false gospel. A gospel I call the two-person gospel because it's me and Jesus. You hear it in every song. You hear it in everybody on AM radio and FM radio. It's me and Jesus. I even had this really great card that I sent somebody once that had 4 sets of footprints, two sets of footprints. And one set stopped, and the other set continued. And it said, when times get really, really bad, Jesus carries you. Me and Jesus, we were going to change who I was. But do you understand, the spiritual birth doesn't change you. It makes you a new person, a new creation. It makes you another person. Your spirit and the Father's Spirit come together. And that is what happens. But this is what we understand. This isn't reality. This is not reality. We are not this person. We become a new person. A new creation. Who is that person? It's a spiritual Son of God. And I began to see that things were spiritual. Things were not with the understanding as clear-cut as this. There was a revelation in it. Let's all say once, what color does red and blue make? Purple. I thought red and blue coexisted, but my flesh cannot coexist with God. My flesh is at enmity with God. So what happened, I went down the road of spiritual sonship. And I'll show you what that road looks like. If I can get up. Sonship. Sonship. I don't write well. Well, that's like an elephant trying to go under those bars in that dance. Thank you, brother. I realized the spiritual birth made me another person. Blue and red made purple. There was one person. Now I wasn't living with union. I was learning oneness. And within oneness, what happens? What do you realize? Identity. When you're one, you have his identity. Well, I started asking myself, aren't I one when I'm spiritually birthed? The Father said, yes, but my people don't know that. My people do not know that when you receive, for all those who receive Christ, he has given the right and the authority to become sons of God. Not by the will of man or flesh, but by his Spirit. He's done this. That verse hit me square on. And I began to realize that every flesh identity I had needed to be walked away from. Not packed away, but walked away from. They had to suffer this death. And from this death would come his life. I got to tell you guys, that first coma I was in, the medically induced one, was probably the hardest time of my life. Because I had everything I had ever done and every identity I had ever lived thrown in my face. And all I could do was sit there and watch it like a movie. It wasn't God doing it. It was the enemy. But I watched every identity, the selfishness, the addiction to porn that I walked in while being a believer. Men, it's too available. Build safeguards around you. And you know what the safeguard is? Becoming another person. I watched every identity I'd ever lived. The disease, the victimhood, the things I did before I was born again, all came before me. And it had not been for the grace of God. It was at this point twice I called out and I said, Father, how can I die? How can I die? Teach me how to die, Father, because I knew I was yet alive. And as I watched these identities and these failures and these things I had done come before me, and I couldn't get up. I was fixed in place, and all I could do was see them. And I said, God, you got to teach me how to die, because I can't watch this anymore. And when I left that house, and it was all behind me, the Father said, don't come back to this house again. Because if you do, son, these identities, you'll pick them up and you'll live them again. He said, don't come back. Walk away. I don't know how long I've taken, but I want to end this time, this last evening, for my part. I want to end this time with a song that ministered to me while I was going through everything. Precious Robbie, as they say, turned me on to it. I'd never heard it before. It's going out again. You always seem to have the magic mic. How is that? How did that happen? I keep turning it off? That's on me then, huh? I know. Minister to me. I'm going to play it for everybody here. But for tonight, being how we tomorrow I would like to become a little more, I guess, more technical. But I still want to end it with this song. So, brother, let me say good night or amen to the recording. And let me start this song.